Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and here I'm doing a bit of a different video here. I mean, this is a video idea I've thought about for a while. Now, initially it was just concepted as talking about what is the most iconic vote off from every season, how I feel like that sort of thing has kind of been done at this point. So while I might do that video still eventually down the road, I did end up changing that topic to where here, instead I'll be talking about what I think is the most game deciding vote of every season. Essentially, what is the vote that was the most integral to the eventual outcome of the season. So with that, we obviously are going to run through every season from Survivor Borneo to Survivor 43, and let's get started off with Survivor Borneo, where I will say right away, I thought it was going to be the Gretchen vote. Obviously, that is the most iconic vote from this season, but beyond that, also the point where it seemed like the Tagis took control. However, I'm actually going to declare it as the Jenna vote, largely for a couple of reasons. One, at the end of the day with the Gretchen vote, while it was this big vote, and it did definitely give the Tagis a lot of power, they were still only 4 people in a tribe of 9 afterwards. They didn't outright have the majority. And really, I would have said the Greg vote would be more integral, as that is kind of the point where they at least get tied in numbers after that vote, though Ozzy Kelly ends up flipping. So really, I do feel like it is the Jenna vote that ends up fully solidifying the trajectory of the season there, where at the Jenna vote, that is where Kelly does end up not voting with the Tagi Alliance. However, that is when Rich, Rudy, and Sue latch on to Sean's Jenna vote, and in turn ends up voting out Jenna in a 4-3-1 vote, which is a vote that really just solidifies the Pagonging moving forward. Where again, before that, the Tagis had not been the outright majority, considering initially Sean was a loose number and then Kelly was a loose number. But after this vote, Sean ends up dumping the alphabet strategy, and really just everything fully solidifies to set it up for a all-Tagi final 5. So I feel like the Jenna vote is the answer here for me. Now from the Australian Outback, and I think this one's the more obvious one. This one is probably the Jeff Varner vote. Now, I will say I did consider the Mitchell vote, as that is where the group that does become the final 3 does first come together. However, even at that point, though, obviously, it was not secure that they were going to win the game. I think it really is the Varner vote that really solidifies it, where at the Varner vote, Ogakor gets the majority afterwards, and while there are votes like the Jerry and Amber votes along the way where they chipped out their own numbers, really that core 3 held the control from that point forward. So again, I do feel like the Jeff vote was the most important one there. Next up, we got Survivor Africa, and again, I think this one's also kind of obvious. Looking at how the season played out, I do think it is the Kelly vote. The Kelly vote is one that ends up really being a battle between the two sides, fighting for the swing in Brandon, but he does end up siding with the Bronze, and through that gives the Bronze the majority moving forward, where he's picked off immediately afterwards, and then Bronze just steamroll their way to the end. Again, like, it's easily the most integral vote of the season. I don't think it's really close. Next up for Survivor Marquesas, and this one was a bit tougher for me because this is a season with a lot of really big votes and a lot of dynamic gameplay, especially towards the end. However, despite all that, I still am going to go with the John Carroll vote. Obviously, the first major flip after the merge. Now, I will say that my one hesitancy with this was the fact that, considering the final 2 of Vesepia and Nalia, their pairing really wasn't solidified until the very end. However, again, like, at the end of the day, the reason why they were able to be final 2 to begin with is because of the John Carroll vote that created this new 5-person alliance that flipped the game. And, while Vesepia was still not well positioned immediately after that, despite being the winner, I do feel like it is still the most integral vote to her trajectory moving forward, as if it wasn't for that, she would have been one of the next few boots. So, again, I do feel like the John Carroll vote is the answer there. Next up for Thailand, and Thailand is actually one of the most difficult seasons to name because really there isn't one. At the end of the day, this season was such a steamroll for Brian Heidick to the point where he didn't really have much adversity when it comes to the votes. The answer would have been the merge vote had they not had the fake merge. However, obviously that didn't occur, and through that, we got 2 rounds of losing Sukchais to where the Chuigans come into the merge up 5-3. So through that, again, like, there really isn't a super solid answer. So for the sake of this list, I am going to go with the Ted vote, mainly because that is the first point where the Chuigans have the flip against each other towards the end game. But really, like, there's not a solid answer here, just because, like, I feel like a lot of the game was dictated through the challenges beforehand, though the Ted vote is probably where there's at least a chance of the vote flipping against Brian, though at least in the sense of it not going his way. But realistically, again, there's not a solid answer here. Next up, moving on to the Amazon, and I think this one's pretty simple, where here I am going to go with the Alex vote. Now, again, this is another weird one where this isn't one that directly led to the winner. However, again, when thinking about this list, I do feel like I have to expand beyond just the winner. And I do feel like the Alex vote is really what set up the eventual endgame. It is what put Rob Cesternino in the power position that he was in, and is also the vote that put Jenna in the underdog position that she was in. That eventually led to her beating out Rob at the very end. I feel like this is the vote that, I mean, it's probably the most iconic of the season, but also is the one that does largely set up how the endgame played out, even though it didn't end up securing the win for the winner in the way that certain other votes that we'll be talking about do. Next up for Pearl Islands, and I feel like this one is definitely between two. Here I do think you got the Rupert vote, which is one that is very similar to the Alex vote, where it is where fair play takes control of the game, and through that it does put Sandra in a more underdog position, to which she eventually gets her way out of. However, I do think unlike the Amazon, where Jenna never really has agency in a vote after the fact, the winner here in Sandra does. So because of that, I am going to pick the Burton vote, as I do feel like the Burton vote is where, again, it does make it more clear that Sandra is more than likely going to win the game. It is where she takes the reins for one of the few times in her early Survivor career, flips the vote on fair play and Burton, and through that sets herself up for a pretty strong endgame. So again, I do feel like the Burton vote is the one that made more sense to me here. Now for All Stars, and this is going to be a bit of a weird one because typically for every season here, I do end up picking a vote that happened at least after the merge. However, this ends up being a pre-merge vote, and that ends up being the Jerry vote. And again, like, this is one that really, at the end of the day, Rob's alliance was going into the merge with numbers, though I do think this vote really solidifies his stranglehold in the game, where through Jerry getting voted out over Amber, obviously it keeps Amber in the game, his number one, but also it makes Lex take out one of his own numbers, to where it becomes such a lopsided breakdown at the merge of a 6-3 instead of a 5-4. And again, Big Tom was obviously a major swing. So it's like, this obviously makes it so that Big Tom can't swing. And through that, Rob just has an outright path to the end. So again, I do feel like the Jerry vote, despite being in the pre-merge, is definitely the most integral one here. Next up for Survivor Vanuatu, and again, I think this one's pretty easy. I do think we have to go with the Leanne vote, where this is obviously where the women that had taken control at the early merge end up flipping against each other, and Chris, the eventual winner, gets finally set up to eventually win the game, where he's able to build his alliance with Twilight and Scout, pull over Eliza, and they take out Leanne, and really from that point forward, Chris has a mostly easy path to the end. So yeah, I feel like that's a simple one there. Now for Palau, and I think Palau is another very difficult one, because again, like, so much of the season is determined on challenges, where with the entire Oolonging, obviously most of those votes don't end up mattering to the eventual outcome. You have the Kobe vote, which is them just simply picking off an outcast. You have the Janu quit, and then you have the Stephanie vote, which was another very obvious vote. So really, it's only like very late votes that are only in consideration here, and realistically, I do think the answer is more than likely just the Ian vote, which is obviously at the final three, which is also just Ian quitting the game, as that's what just outright gives Tom the win, as I think outside of that is really just a Tom versus Ian battle. However, that's not much of a vote. So the vote that I am going to give the most credit here for is, again, not really that integral in the grand scheme of things, but I am going to give it to the Greg vote, as I do feel like the Greg vote is a situation where Greg and Jen had been trying to work on Katie to potentially flip the game on Tom and Ian, though here obviously they end up striking first and end up really strong arming Katie in order to do so. And through doing this, they really secure their numbers moving forward. Though obviously, again, Ian flips on Tom by final four, but considering that was unsuccessful, I do feel like I am going to make the Greg vote the most important one here. Now for Guatemala, and again, this is our one. There aren't that many truly game deciding votes. I mean, I did want to avoid these like extremely binary situations where realistically the answer is probably the Lydia vote. However, I just feel like that's too easy. Instead, I am going to go with the Judd vote here. I do feel like the Judd vote is kind of the start of the downward trajectory for Stephanie and Rafe, where, I mean, like, technically it's the Jamie vote, but there I feel like there was a bit more of a consensus in taking out Jamie, while with the Judd vote, I do think it makes Judd extremely bitter. It also irritates Cindy, and she ends up being the following boot, and this continuously prolongs Danny's spot in the game to where she ends up winning final immunity to win the game. So it's like, I feel like the Judd vote is kind of the start of that, but like, again, realistically, I don't think there is a solid answer here outside of the very binary choice of the Lydia Danny vote. Now for Panama, and this one's pretty simple. I mean, it's the Courtney vote. It's the 3-2-1 vote. Again, a very impressive maneuver from Suri, where she ends up taking out Courtney, the presumed GOAT, the person that the likes of Terry and Shane had wanted to take to the end, while also solidifying her alliance with Aris and Danielle. This group that does hold true, obviously, until Terry's idol comes into effect, but this is a vote that does largely save Aris, who was the consensus vote off the bat there, and obviously Aris ends up winning the game. So again, like, I feel like the 3-2-1 vote here is definitely the most integral to how the season played out. Next up, we got Cook Islands, and again, there's no competition here. It has to be the Nate vote, the merge tribal where Penner ends up flipping. Yule uses his idol to get Penner to flip. Again, like, it's far and away the most important vote of the season. It gives the I-2-4 the majority moving forward, really facing no adversity, considering the other side is so hung up on taking out Penner. Again, it is easily the Nate vote here. Now for Fiji, and this is another pretty easy one, we do have the Edgardo vote, which is another one that really just dictates the rest of the game. It puts the 4 horsemen on the bottom and leads up to them being pagonged. It also secures Earl's spot in the game to where he now has alliances with really everyone outside of the 4 horsemen, and more than likely beats everybody by that point. So easily the most integral vote there. Next for Survivor, China. And I will say, I think China is a difficult one because I don't think there is a super solid answer, largely because the final 3 end up comprising of a group of players that worked together from the very beginning and never really faced that much adversity. I mean, they do come into the merge with a wide majority. And while there are points where they flip on their own, really they had a stranglehold from beginning to end. I will say, for the sake of this list, I did end up going to the James vote still, just because it was a situation where James obviously had 2 idols, and through that, if he had survived that round, he would have been guaranteed final 4, and through that could have messed up who got into the end. And at that point, who knows if James wins the jury vote. So for the sake of this list, I am going to go with the James vote. Now for Micronesia, and Micronesia is obviously a season that is filled with very iconic votes. However, for me, the clear answer here has to be the Aussie vote, which is obviously not the most iconic vote of the season. Obviously, most people would say the Eric Reichenbach vote. However, obviously, that's a position where the Black Widow Brigade already had power. And really, they just need to stop Eric from winning immunity. And while obviously they struggled with, and them convincing him to give up immunity is what leads to his downfall there, I do feel like the Aussie vote is the thing that sets everything in motion. It is what gives them the numbers moving forward to where they really just steamroll the rest of the game. I mean, through the Aussie vote, they end up having 5 of the remaining 8 players. It's what allows them to pull off these really insane moves like the Jason and Eric vote. So again, for me, I do feel like the Aussie vote is the answer. Now for Gabon, and again, this is another strange case where we are picking a pre-merge tribal, though a weird circumstance that even was a pre-merge tribal. And here we are picking the Marcus boots, as again, it is obviously the Marcus boot that really sets everything in motion. It causes the downfall of the Kodas to where they take out their leader and come into the merge. The people outside of the core Koda group end up having the numbers. Now, I will say I did debate the Corinne vote, as that is where Kenny really messes everything up. That really solidifies the group that's going to make it to the end, with Kenny and Crystal being on the bottom after that. But really, I do feel like a lot of that still stems from the Marcus vote. And again, while Bob is the eventual winner here, it's not like there was any point where he had true agency in how the vote was playing out. So I feel like the Marcus vote is the one that set his underdog trajectory in motion as well. So again, I am going to go with the Marcus vote. Now for Tocantins, and again, this one's pretty easy. I do think it is the Tyson vote. Now again, technically the Brendan vote is the precursor to that, where the Brendan vote gives them the opening to execute the Tyson vote. However, the Tyson vote is where they really solidify their numbers. Taking out Tyson gives Jalapao 3 people plus Aaron, 4 out of the final 7, really securing their control in the game moving forward. So again, that is the answer here. Next up for Survivor, Samoa, and same thing. Again, there are tribals before the one I picked that lead up to it. However, I am going to go with the Laura Moret tribal. As again, the 2 tribals beforehand, the Eric Cardona and the Kelly tribals, are very important in the fact that they do chip away at the Galoon numbers. However, it really is the Laura tribal where the Fofoas get a full stranglehold, where through Fofoa flipping over Shambo and then getting Fincher to flip over in a tie, that is what gives them their numbers moving forward to where they really just steamroll until Brett ends up winning immunity. So again, I do feel like that is the solid answer here. Now for heroes versus villains, and this one's also pretty easy. I am going to go with the JT vote, as that is the merge vote. It is what gives the villains the numbers moving forward to where the villains do end up becoming the final four. Now I will say that again, obviously there is the turbulence of the Danielle vote along the way, and I did consider that. However, I do feel like at the end of the day, it all stems back to the JT vote, where had Parvati not gotten to the end, I probably would have picked the Danielle vote, but considering Parvati does still get to the end, I feel like the JT vote and just the villains outright having the numbers is what makes it the most defining vote there. Now for Nicaragua, we're moving on to a vote that I feel like no one really talks about, but then again, it's Nicaragua and strategy, which do not mix. But still, I feel like I hear people talk about the Marty vote and the Brenda vote more. However, I do think the deciding vote of the season does end up becoming the Benry vote. A vote where that does solidify the Chase-Holly trio that does end up running the end game, while also is a big crux point for the game where they are through voting out Benry instead of Fabio. It obviously gives Fabio the runway immediately afterwards to just win out from that point forward. And again, in a position where Fabio doesn't have much agency moving forward, I do feel like the fact that this is the vote that made him the underdog, while also was a point where he could have gone home, and also the fact that the strategic force of the end game comes together here, I do feel like the Benry vote made sense here. Now for Redemption Island, and I mean, come on, it's the map vote. The second map vote, I should say. Again, very clearly, there's no other question here. It's the vote where Bossa Rob outplays the Zapateras. Zapateras go home in a Pagongi immediately afterwards, while he also secures his own group and now instilling fear in them, in where it makes them think that if they flip, then they're going to be next. And again, it's just a masterful move from Boss Rob that really secures his position in the tribe to where obviously it leads up to his win. So because of that, I did pick the map vote. For South Pacific, this one was a bit tougher. I do think there are two major votes in the season. However, at the end of the day, I'm still going to go with the Keith vote, which was the merge vote. Now again, I did consider the Brandon vote, where that was one where Brandon was the biggest jury threat out of the Upolus, and they're able to get him to give up immunity only to vote him out immediately afterwards. Again, that's a big vote. However, I do feel like the Keith vote is really what solidified the end game, where at the end of the day, I mean, that is where Upolu gets the advantage against Savai. Savai goes out 1 by 1. And obviously we have Ozzy coming back, but they proceed to take him out. But really, it's like the Upolu core group of Sophie, Albert, and Coach was already in place by this point in the game. So I do feel like this was the determining vote, as really they just need to stick true to each other, which again, they wavered at points, but I do feel like this ends up becoming the most important vote there. Now for Survivor One World, and this is another one that I think has a couple answers. I'm going to go with the Michael vote. I feel like that is where Kim really takes a stranglehold on the game, deciding to side with the women and flipping on her swap tribe, and through that also makes sure that the women have the majority moving forward. Where again, I think you could debate the J vote, as that's where it really solidifies. However, realistically, the women already had the numbers at that point. It was more so Troyzan having an idol that could possibly mess things up, but it doesn't happen. Now also, I think you can argue the Bill vote all the way back in the pre-merge, as again, that's a situation where they threw immunity to vote out Bill. In a situation where the men and women come into the merge tied in numbers. If that had not been the case, who really knows what the numbers are? But again, at the end of the day, I am going to go with the Michael vote still. Next up for Survivor Philippines, again, another situation of there probably being more interesting votes like the Jeff vote or the Penner vote. However, I think I'm going to still go with the artist vote, where the artist vote is the vote that determines the group that is going to make the end game. Now again, the Jeff vote is definitely a bigger vote. The problem is that the people who lose out in the very following vote end up winning that vote, while when it comes to the Penner vote, I feel like that one is obviously very much up for grabs. However, I feel like that more so solidified a thing that was already occurring, where if the Denise Malcolm, Lisa Skupin Final Four was formed at that exact moment, I do think that probably would be the vote I would pick. But considering it was formed in the rounds beforehand, I am going to go with the artist vote, as that is what gave that group the potential to come together. So I am going to go with that one. Next up for Caramoan, I think this one's a very difficult one because, again, this is another one with a lot of big votes. The question is which one was the most important to the outcome. And I think I'm just going to go with the merge vote in the Corinne vote. Largely because, Cochran had the game pretty locked in from early on. I don't see really anybody beating Cochran in a jury vote. Maybe Malcolm, who was never going to get there, and possibly Andrea, which is why I also debated the Andrea vote off. However, I do feel like the Corinne vote off here just really solidified the Stealth R Us side of things, having the numbers. And while, again, there are important votes afterwards, like the Michael vote, that further secures them. You have the Philip vote, which gets rid of their figurehead. You have the Andrea vote, that, again, I think takes out the biggest threat to Cochrane, though realistically, I think he had the game unlocked already by that point anyway, as Andrew was someone that was willing to take Cochrane towards the end anyway. And then we have the Brenda vote, where I think that fully locks in the final 3, but again, I feel like they formed before that anyway. So I do feel like the Corinne vote is probably the one. I do think it is the one that gave Cochrane's alliance the numbers to where he was always the best position within that alliance from that point forward anyway. Next up, for Survivor, Blood versus Water, and I feel like there's a couple obvious votes that come to mind. Obviously the Aris vote, where Tyson stages a coup against him, and you also have the Katie rock draw, which is obviously very important as well. However, I do feel like the actual answer is probably the Caleb vote, the vote before the rock draw, as that's what makes it so that the other side is forced to go to a rock draw, as really just Tyson completely outplays the old Tahana there, getting Sierra to go on his side. And while again Sierra flips at the very next round, it's a situation where they have to go to a rock draw that they end up losing anyway. So I do feel like the Caleb vote is really where the endgame structure ends up solidifying, and really the rock draw is just a continuation of that. Or again, if Sierra and Hayden had been successful in the rock draw, then I would have made that the vote, though I think realistically, because Tyson does end up winning out, it has to be the other one. Next up for Survivor, Cagayan, and I think this was pretty simple. I mean, I think it has to be the Sarah vote, as that is the vote that gives Tony the runway to maneuver moving forward. However, I could see serious debates for certain other votes, largely the LJ and Jeffra votes, where he's taking out his threats along the way. However, I feel like at the end of the day, again, it all just stems back to the Sarah vote, where he gets his numbers to begin with, and those following votes are really just him picking off certain numbers. So I do feel like the Sarah vote was the most integral vote there. Next up for San Juan del Sur, and I think this is another one. You could debate a lot of votes here. You could debate the West vote, the John vote, the Baylor vote. The Baylor vote in particular being the one that secures the win for Natalie. However, I'm going to go all the way back to the Jeremy vote, where I do feel like the Jeremy vote does a couple major things. It, one, solidifies the group that ends up running a lot of the game moving forward, where John takes control of the game, but also that becomes such an integral part of her storyline. Considering it all stems back to this vote, the vote that also creates the group that runs the end game, I feel like the Jeremy vote was the answer here. Now for Worlds Apart, and straight up, Worlds Apart does not really have a solid answer here. I do think Worlds Apart is a weird season, where again, it's very competition based, in the sense that obviously Mike ends up winning out, to where the votes themselves don't matter as much. However, I do feel like something that is understated about the events of the season is how Mike takes out his biggest threats along the way and actively maneuvers through the game in order to do so, to maximize his chances of winning out. And I feel like the most obvious example of this does end up being the Joe vote, where, I mean, like, technically, probably the Tyler vote was the one that was where he was doing it a bit more actively, where, like, realistically Joe is the target for almost everybody. But I do feel like the Joe vote is the most important one. I do think the Joe vote is the one that actually allows him to win out, as Joe is someone that would have won a lot more competitions had he remained in the game, competitions that Mike needed to win at that point. So I think by getting rid of Joe, it allowed Mike to win those competitions. So I do think the Joe vote, while seemingly insignificant, does end up becoming a very important vote across season, largely due to how Mike's comp run starts immediately afterwards. Now for Survivor, Cambodia, and I feel like this is a very tough one to name an actual defining vote, considering it is one where there's such dynamic gameplay across the season that essentially the point of this entire video is to find the point where the season becomes a bit more stagnant in its power structure, and really there isn't really a solid point in Cambodia until the very tail end of the game. So here I am going to go with the Kimmy vote, where again, I do think it's a situation where you have these important votes like the Savage vote, the Kelly vote, the Steven vote, but all of those still have a lot of fluctuation immediately afterwards. I feel like it is the Kimmy vote that really solidifies how the endgame's going to play out, where the likes of Jeremy, Spencer, and Tasha really take control from that point forward and face no real adversity. So I feel like that is the vote I'm going to pick here. Now for Rong, I feel like this one's pretty simple. I mean, while there are important votes like the Nick and Debbie votes, I do feel like it is the Scott Pollard vote that clearly is the most influential here. It being a situation where, again, it fully solidifies Aubrey's alliance. It has Aubrey pulling in Ty, already having Sydney and Joe, and that becoming the core of her alliance. The likes of Michelle and Julia, who had voted with her in the last few rounds, get kicked out of her alliance. And also it takes out a major figure in the season, where at that point you have a clear minority. So again, I feel like this is definitely the definitive vote of the season there. Now for Millennials versus Gen X, and this is one that again is kind of easy considering my criteria, and it's not the most explosive vote of the season, but I do think it has to go to the Zeke vote. Now again, obviously you have the rock draw, which is a very important situation, but kind of like the Jeff Kent vote that I talked about before, it's kind of the calm before the storm. It's around where essentially the people that end up losing out before the end game end up winning that battle. So again, like at the end of the day, was it that important? Not particularly. So again, at the end of the day, was it the most important vote? Not really. And you have votes like the Chris vote, which obviously starts the fracturing within the majority alliance. And you have the Michaela vote, which causes the likes of Jay and Will to be on the outs coming into the merge. But I do think at the end of the day, the Zeke vote is definitely the most important one. Again, causes the most stagnation afterwards, to where the Adam, Ken, David, Hannah force them become the majority, especially after they vote out Will. But again, the Zeke vote allows them to do that. I do think the Zeke vote is definitely the answer here. Now for Game Changers. In Game Changers, a situation similar to Cambodia. Again, a weird season to pick a vote for, considering how much dynamic gameplay there was going on. Again, I think the Ozzy and Debbie votes were very important ones, but again, the alliances that form off of those don't fully stick. So because I am going to end up picking the Michaela vote. Now, I think in many ways you can consider the Suri elimination, though one, it wasn't really a vote. But really, even more importantly, I do think at the end of the day, that was more so facing off against the ramifications of the Michaela vote, with Suri trying to put together a rebellion. That obviously doesn't go through. But the Michaela vote is what does set up the Sarah, Troy, Brad alliance that ends up running the end game. And again, with the loss of Suri at advantage, again, it also just further solidifies their control in the game. But I do feel like the Michaela vote is the start of all that. Next up, we have HHH, and I feel like this one has two very important votes. However, I do think here I have to go with the Lauren vote. The Lauren vote is the one that starts Ben's underdog trajectory of where he starts to idle his way to the end. It also is the point where Ben starts to be on the bottom, where again, like before that, he was pretty well positioned within the majority alliance. The other option here would have been the JP vote, where again, that was a spot where Ben was probably the best positioned in the entire game. However, considering he loses that control by the end and has to rely on idols, I do feel like the Lauren vote being the start of that trajectory is the vote to pick here. Next up for Ghost Island, which is kind of a weird one just because the season's pretty stagnant for a lot of it anyway. But again, I did consider something like the Chris Noble vote, where it feels like that's where Wendell and Dominic start to get control. You also have the Sebastian vote, though again, that felt very defensive more so than anything. I do think the vote that I'm going to pick here ends up being kind of a random one in the grand scheme of things, but I do think it's the Chelsea vote. It's the vote where I think that really the rest of the game was dictated, where at that point you had Chelsea, Kellen, Angela on one side, and you had Wendell and Dominic, and I guess Sebastian on the other side, and it was Donathan and Laurel picking which side to go with. And I think this was the point where it became very clear that Laurel was going to stick with Dom and Wendell. Again, really solidifying how the end game was going to shake up, and because that it is the answer for me here. Next up, we have David versus Goliath, which I think is another one that has a couple really great vote-offs that aren't my eventual answer. I mean, the John Hennigan vote-off is one of my favorites in the history of the show, and it does start the rise of the Davids, while the Dan vote does further secure that. However, then they flip on each other. So because of that, I do have to go with the Carl vote here. Again, the vote where the Davids start the fracture, they take out one of their own, and through that, the Goliaths start to gain the majority back through the next couple rounds. Though obviously through all of this, Nick ends up winning out anyway, ends up winning. However, I do feel like the Carl vote here is the start of all those storylines, because that was the answer here. Next up for Edge of Extinction, and again, this is a very tough one because of how dynamic the gameplay was. Also, considering the winner wasn't even in the game until the very end, I am going to go with the Victoria vote here, as I do think that is the most integral to determining the outcome. It is the only vote that Chris ends up being vulnerable in the end game. Ends up pulling off a really great move and getting Lauren to play the idol on him, while also getting rid of Victoria, the biggest threat in the game outside of Rick, and really just, again, setting up Chris for his eventual run. I do feel like the Victoria vote is the answer here. Now for IOI, and this is a very abnormal one because it's not just one tribal in my eyes, it is a double tribal. And I feel like the most integral votes here do come from the Aaron and Missy double tribal, with them going home back to back. Where realistically, again, the Kelly vote was very important. It did start to give Tommy and Lauren their numbers. However, I don't feel like they really solidify their numbers until Aaron and Missy are taken out. But also through taking out Aaron and Missy, I do think it is even better for Tommy in particular, obviously the eventual winner, where through that he is getting towards the end game with a lot of the people that are closer to him than they are to Lauren, where Lauren loses out on numbers in Missy and Aaron. And really from that point forward, they hold a lot of control in the game, really just steamroll the rest of the game. And while obviously the Janet vote is a bit wonky, it also wouldn't have been if Dan wasn't ejected. So really, I do feel like the Aaron and Missy vote, particularly the Missy side, thanks considering Tommy's involvement in it, is probably the most integral vote of the season. Except for Survivor 40, and I mean, this is really easy. It's obviously the Sophie vote. There's like really no question. I mean, the other important votes of the season, the second Tyson vote, it's like, again, that forms a group that fractures the very following round. The Kim vote, kind of a similar thing to where a lot of that round is to save Jeremy, only for Jeremy to still be taken out. And really just even beyond that, again, like it's obviously the Sophie vote. I mean, to me, the Sophie vote is still one of the most impressive moves in the history of Survivor. I mean, the fact that Tony essentially solidifies his win through that one singular vote is really impressive. Mind you, obviously, he does get unlucky in the fact that it's a season with Edge of Extinction, and that obviously harms his positioning by the time the Edge of Extinction occurs. But if it was not for that, Tony would have just outright won the game at this point. He would have had the position within the core power structure that did hold together to really just run the game and win a jury vote. But obviously, because of Edge of Extinction, he faces more adversity, but still wins even despite that. So again, I do feel like the Sophie vote's the answer. Now for 41, and I mean 41, I think it's pretty easy. I think it is the Shan vote. I really don't know what other vote it would really be. I mean, the Nasir vote seems like a setup to the Shan vote. It's like I kind of considered it, but like at the end of the day, obviously the Shan vote's more important. It's like beyond that, I guess you could say maybe like the Ricard vote. But really, none of these feel as important as the Shan vote. The Shan vote is what really sets up the end game by putting Deshaun, Danny, and Liana on the bottom. Also setting up Ricard as this big threat that eventually gets taken out along the way, while also putting Erica in a really strong position. So I do feel like the Shan vote is the answer here. Now for 42, we're moving on to, again, another one I think is pretty easy. I mean, obviously the one that is declared as Marianne's big move, and that is the Omer boot. I do think the Omer boot is really the only vote I can truly consider. I mean, like Hai and Drea were the boots before that, and they were considered like big threats. However, I don't feel like they were that integral to the outcome of the season, to having Marianne, Mike, and Romeo at the end, and really exuding the savviness that stems from Marianne, and also the flaws of Mike's game. I do feel like the Omer boot really encapsulates all of that. It has Marianne's big move. It has Mike backing down of the big move. It really sets up Marianne and Romeo's relationship to where they go to the end together. Like, it really is a really important vote there, so that is the one I picked here. And now for 43, and I think this one's kind of a tough one to truly gauge here, in the sense that the people that made it to the very end are the people that really didn't make the bigger moves of the season. I do feel like a lot of the moves across the season were made by the likes of Cody and Jesse, particularly moves like the Noelle move and the Dwight move. However, I think here, the move that was probably the most influential and leading to the eventual outcome is the one that's talked about as the biggest move of the season, and that ends up being the Cody move. Which, again, is weird to pick this, as, again, I do think this was Jesse's move, where the finalists in Gabler, Owen, and Cassidy, while obviously voting alongside him, didn't seem to be major orchestrators of this move. However, I am putting it here because, at the end of the day, it is what put them in the position to outright have the majority following this, and be able to maneuver their way to the end, while also being this major moment for the season, feeling like the point where Jesse becomes such a big target to where the rest of the season is focused around getting him out. So again, I felt like this was the move that was only right to pick here. But there we go. I mean, that is what I look at as the game-deciding vote from every season. But again, moving forward, I would like to do more videos like this. I think something that stands out to me as an idea for down the road is the worst move for every season. I think that's something to definitely talk about. But again, that'll be for later on. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.